In April 1955, Albert Einstein was lying in Princeton Hospital with a ruptured aorta. The doctors offered surgery. He refused. He said, "I want to go when I want to go." Extending life artificially is pointless. I have done my part. It is time to leave. A few days later, he died. On his bedside table lay sheets of paper covered in writing, final calculations, final thoughts, and among them, what he had been writing about death and what comes after it throughout his entire life, in private letters, in conversations with those he trusted never intended for the public. Because what Einstein thought about death, about the soul, and about the nature of time, did not fit the religious worldview, and did not fit the picture that science expected from him either. It was something third, and that third thing, as you will see today, is remarkably close to what Edgar Cayce described and what people who have experienced clinical death report. Stay with me, because one paragraph from a letter Einstein wrote to the mother of a dying friend, a paragraph almost nobody talks about, will change how you think about death, permanently. Let's start with what most people know and why it is an incomplete picture. Einstein publicly said he did not believe in a personal God, a God who watches over every individual, hears prayers, intervenes in destinies. That is true. He said it directly and repeatedly, and this is precisely why he is often categorized as an atheist. But here is what is almost never added. Einstein, with equal consistency, said he was not an atheist, that the word atheist was unacceptable to him, that denying God seemed to him just as presumptuous as naive belief in an old man on a cloud, that beyond everything science can measure, something exists, something he called different things in different contexts, the God of Spinoza, a cosmic religious feeling, the mystery, and it is precisely in his attempts to describe this something, in private letters, in conversations, in notes never intended for publication, that Einstein said things about death that no physics textbook will ever quote. The first of these, and this is what stunned Nobel laureate Max Born when he read it in a private letter, was Einstein's writing about the nature of time. Not as a physicist describing the theory of relativity for colleagues, as a man who had understood something about the nature of time and understood what that meant for death. He wrote, "The distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion, not a poetic metaphor, a physical statement. For the equations that describe the universe, past, present, and future, are equivalent and coexist. One does not replace another. All three exist simultaneously. And if that is so, if the past does not disappear and the future already exists, then what we call death is not an ending, but a transition from one point in this eternal structure to another. You do not cease to exist. You simply cease to be in the present moment." Einstein did not formulate this as a spiritual teaching. He formulated it as physics, and that is precisely what makes it so hard to dismiss. February 1950, Robert Marcus, a young rabbi, had lost his son. He wrote to Einstein, not knowing why, simply wrote. Einstein replied, and in that reply, in a few paragraphs written by an elderly scientist to a rabbi he had never met, there is something that does not fit any version of Einstein the atheist that exists in popular culture. He wrote that a human being is a part of the whole which we call the universe, a part limited in space and time. He experiences himself, his thoughts and feelings, as something separate from the rest. This is a kind of optical delusion of his consciousness. This delusion is a kind of prison for us, restricting us to our personal desires and to affection for a few persons nearest to us. Our task must be to free ourselves from this prison by widening our circle of compassion to embrace all living creatures and the whole of nature in its beauty. This is not consolation in a religious sense. It is a statement about the nature of a human being that directly contradicts the idea that death is an ending, because if a human being is part of a whole, rather than a separate entity that begins at birth and ends at death, then death is not annihilation, but a change in the form in which that part exists within the whole. Now, the letter that sold at Christie's auction in 2018 for $1,560,000, the so-called God letter. Einstein wrote it in 1954, a year before his death, to the German philosopher Erich Gutkind in response to his book on religion. This letter became the most expensive Einstein autograph ever sold precisely because in it he speaks about God and religion with a candor absent from any of his public statements. He writes that the word God is for him nothing more than the expression and product of human weakness, that the Bible is a collection of honorable but still primitive legends, that the Jewish religion, like all other religions, is an incarnation of the most childish superstitions. This is the part atheists quote. But there is another part, one that is cited far less often. In the same letter, Einstein writes that nevertheless there exists something he experiences as a religious feeling that is not belief in a personal God, that when he looks at the structure of the universe, its mathematical beauty, its internal coherence, the fact that the laws of physics work identically everywhere and always, he feels something that has no other name than awe, that this awe before the mystery standing behind everything visible is the religious feeling he considers genuine, as distinct from religious institutions that attempt to capture this feeling in doctrine. And here is what makes the God letter so important for understanding Einstein's actual view of death. He did not believe in the God of the Bible, but he believed in something structured, something that has mathematical laws, something that produces a universe so coherent and so beautiful that it generates awe even in a man who spent his life measuring it. That something, whatever we choose to call it, was for Einstein not a comforting fiction. It was the most real thing he knew. Now, the letter that is possibly the most direct statement about death Einstein ever committed to writing. He wrote it to the family of Michel Besso, his closest friend of 50 years, a fellow physicist, the man he had discussed his ideas with throughout his entire career. Besso died in March 1955. Einstein outlived him by less than a month, and in the letter to Besso's family, one of the last things he wrote, there are words that many consider his personal credo about death. He has departed from this strange world a little ahead of me. That means nothing. For us convinced physicists, the distinction between past, present, and future is only a stubbornly persistent illusion. Stop for a moment. Einstein, one of the greatest physicists in history, the man who changed how humanity understands space and time, wrote to the family of a dead friend that death means nothing. Not as consolation, as a physical fact, because the time that makes death final is an illusion. And if time is an illusion, then death is not what it appears to be. He is not in heaven. He is not in nowhere. He is in another point, the same universe, the same space-time, simply in a different point of a structure that has no beginning and no end, because time within it is not a river that flows, but a space that exists wholly and simultaneously. This is not mysticism. This is physics, and this is precisely what makes Einstein's statements about death so explosive. He was not appealing to faith. He was appealing to equations. Now, the most unexpected parallel, the one that explains why this video exists on a channel about the afterlife rather than only in physics textbooks. Edgar Cayce, a man with no physics education, living at the same time as Einstein, described in his readings again and again what happens to consciousness after death through images strikingly close to what Einstein was describing through physics. Cayce said that consciousness is not limited by time, that past, present, and future, from the perspective of the soul, exist simultaneously, that death is not an ending, but a change in the angle of view on a reality that continues to exist, that what we call a dead person does not disappear. They simply cease to be visible from our point in time. Cayce said this as a mystic. Einstein said it as a physicist. The language was different. The description was remarkably similar. Pim van Lommel, the Dutch cardiologist who conducted the largest scientific study of NDE in history, published in The Lancet in 2001, interviewing 344 patients who survived cardiac arrest, wrote something in his book that directly echoes what Einstein said. Van Lommel proposed that consciousness is not a product of the brain, that the brain is rather a receiver of consciousness that exists independently of it, and that this is precisely what explains why people with a flat line on the EEG without brain activity describe detailed, clear, coherent experience. If consciousness is not in the brain, then the stopping of the brain is not the stopping of consciousness. Einstein never formulated it precisely this way, but his physics, the theory of relativity, the unity of space-time, the impossibility of destroying energy, creates exactly the theoretical framework into which Van Lommel's observation fits organically. Energy does not disappear, it transforms. If consciousness is a form of energy, and Van Lommel argues that it is, then death is not the destruction of consciousness, but its transformation. Einstein refused the surgery, said it was time to go, died as a man who knew where he was going, and left behind, in letters never intended for the public, in the physics he spent his life developing, in that final phrase about his friend, a description of death that is neither religious nor materialist. That is something third, something that a physicist arrived at through equations and a mystic arrived at through trance, and that people who have crossed the boundary between life and death arrived at through direct experience, simply in a different point. Write in the comments. Did what you heard today change anything in how you think about death? And is there something in Einstein's words, not a priest's, not a mystic's, but a physicist's, that gives you more peace than any religious consolation you have ever heard?